I wanted to do a review of Something Unbelievable by Maria Kuznetsova. I had previously read Oksana Behave by her. Throughout this video, I am going to be periodically referring to my notes. I tend to be a little bit long-winded, so I want to make sure that I catch everything I want to say and don't get sidetracked too much. Also, if you need to charge your phone, there's an outlet there for you, so feel free to make use of that. The story begins with Natasha, a new mother, talking with her own grandmother and trying to find out stories of her grandmother's experiences in Ukraine and later kind of moving into the Ural Mountains during World War II and like other stuff about the Soviet Union. It's presented kind of as a way for Natasha to have stories of her grandmother to pass down to her daughter, but we can also see it's a way for these two characters to connect with each other. And as the story progresses, we see how there are some similarities between the two women. Also, the story does focus a lot on Natasha trying to reclaim herself after giving birth. She's trying to move away from being a mother, which she finds incredibly isolating and lonely and kind of boring. She wants to get back into acting and like bartending and these other stuff that she did before she had her child, but is finding it somewhat difficult to get back into the swing of things. So a couple of the main characters on sort of Natasha's side of the story, we have her. She is like the main character. She's kind of a little messy. She's a little bit of a wild child. And I would describe her as like a pretty flawed character. You don't read this character and think you're relating to them all the time, and you're always seeing them make decisions that maybe you wouldn't make. You then have her very reliable husband, Yuri, who is a math professor at a community college, and she met Yuri through her father. You also have Stas, who is Yuri's sort of deadbeat poet friend who's living on their couch. And you have Tali, their baby. She doesn't really do a lot because she's a baby. And then in the background, you have Natasha talking about the relationship she had with her parents, who are now deceased. And you see this sort of like ensemble of other characters, like the Borscht babes, who she's sort of like competing for roles in like various TV show stuff, like opportunities that she gets. And then on Larissa's side of the story, you have, I guess I'll just go in this random order. You have Larissa's grandmother, Tonya, who is like frivolous and comes from a very wealthy background, and sort of seen as just kind of weak and maybe pompous, or like kind of she has her nose sticking up in the air. She thinks she's better than other people. And then you have Larissa's sister, Polina, who is very similar. She's described as like an animal lover. She's really weak. She's really sentimental and emotional. And this stands out to Larissa, who as a character is very strong, very hard, very sort of like your standard Soviet woman. Like that image is what you should be thinking about. You also have Larissa and Polina's parents, and they're much more similar to Larissa. They're both very hardworking. They, don't spend beyond their means. They try to help people out. They don't want to live an ostentatious life. And as Larissa is forced to go east, fleeing the Nazis, you meet other characters as well, such as Bogdan and Misha, who are two young, like they're the sons of this like family traveling with them. They're both from good family. Bogdan is very goofy. He's not really intellectual. But he's very like caring, and Misha, he is intellectual, he is very goal-oriented, but he doesn't necessarily stand up for people in the way that his brother might. Going on with some themes that I noticed throughout the book, there's a huge theme of like family protecting family feeling like they're learning from the mistakes of other people, but this is not always something that is made obvious and not always dealt with in the nicest way. A character will do something and throughout the book it doesn't look like the right thing, or two characters won't have a great relationship, but then you later on learn that it's people who were trying to act in the best the best way, but then maybe they weren't able to do that, or them doing that sacrificed their relationship. So a lot of also people surprising you, you know, you think a character is X, but then it's revealed later that they actually, they're Y, or like they're mostly X, but sometimes they're also Y. So definitely I think Kuznetsova really succeeds at having well-rounded characters, having characters who don't just, you know, they aren't one note, they have more depth to them. And I find this a very realistic thing in her book. I think in general, when she writes books, she writes very flawed characters, very realistic characters. And in that way, like, I don't think her characters always learn and grow, or they might learn and grow, but they don't end up being like a significantly better version of themselves. We as audience are learning from their experiences, but we can see that maybe they're not learning, or maybe like, what is it, dramatic irony, like you're seeing something that's very obvious to you as the reader, but is not, the character is clearly not getting that. Another really big theme is sort of this duality, or these foils, or people being really similar to each other. So in Larissa's sort of version of the story, in her parts, I should say, she is very much like, I am really strong and I don't coddle people, but my sister, she's so weak and she's always crying and really emotional and really pretty, and I'm not as pretty as my sister, and we're different. And so you see that, and you're constantly having these people compared to each other. So like Larissa and her sister, Misha and Bogdan. You have like Yuri and Stas. And then you also have like through family certain stuff. So you have like Larissa and Natasha being really different. In the same way, you have like characters being very similar. So Larissa's constantly describing her granddaughter as being similar to her sister, because like, oh, she really likes animals and cares for stupid things, so she must be like my sister. And so that element really plays throughout. And I think there's a somewhat prescriptive nature of, you're sentimental, that means you're weak. And I think throughout the story, that line of logic is really questioned, because certain characters are able to be very strong when they're not expected to be, or they end up being very, they end up being like really just surprising. And like I said earlier, I appreciated that. And I like the idea that strength doesn't mean that you're like always stone-faced. You can be strong even if like you were crying 30 seconds ago. I also thought it was really funny, early on in the book you learn that Larissa has like outlived her sister by decades, and she sort of says like, oh yes, it's because I'm so much stronger than my sister, that's why this happened. But as you read the book, like, spoiler, like very small spoiler, it has nothing to do with like Larissa being a stronger person. It's just like this weird idea that she has. And I thought that was very on point for a character like Larissa to have that view. Now getting into some of the pros and the cons that I personally felt in the book, I'm going to start with pros. That is an excellent example of Eastern European humor, and it's just a funny story in general. I really feel like the characters acted like how like a Ukrainian grandmother would act, or how the daughter of Ukrainian immigrants would act. These are realistic characters. I sort of describe it as written by an appropriate party. When you have someone who is telling a story and they have enough background to tell a culturally, I don't say correct, but like a culturally appropriate way of acting. If you're from any type of background, I don't know how to describe this, but like, I don't know what it's like to be Chinese. If I was to tell a story about a Chinese girl in 1920s China, that would not be accurate. I don't have the cultural context to know how certain characters would behave, and if a Chinese person was to read that story, it might be very off-putting to them, because they'll constantly be pulled out of the story because of how culturally inaccurate it can be. I also appreciate, and I think I said this before, the story doesn't have this like neat, happy, tied-up ending. The characters have problems they haven't resolved, but I think, to me, it's very realistic, and I think it makes for these characters who like you have seen part of their lives, but you know that they are going to keep moving forward. You know that there's still stuff happening to them. And I feel like it makes it kind of nice that the characters maybe didn't have like a personal like growth arc, because you're still going. Like, you learned these lessons just now. You can't be expected to apply them to your life immediately. I just appreciated it. I think for a lot of people that'll probably be a con, that these characters don't grow too much, that the story doesn't get wrapped up really neatly. But for me, it was good. Also, the characters, like I said, they're so flawed, but they're still very likable. I feel like in Kuznetsova's first book, her characters weren't as likable. You were like, I don't know, I was constantly cringing at how Oksana behaves in that book. But in this book, I actually really liked Natasha and found her not necessarily relatable, but like enjoyable to read about, which was the part I was really worried about in this book, knowing I was going to definitely prefer half of the book to another half. Being able to actually enjoy Natasha's parts was nice, and I think Kuznetsova did a good job of making Natasha's parts significantly shorter than Larissa's, because I don't think it would have been good to have them like on equal length. Some cons I feel for the story is it was too short. It's not a very long book, and in that way I think there's a lot more that you could go into with characters' relationships, going into post-World War II. I think we could have heard more from Larissa and what those experiences were like. I also feel like we could have gotten more character development. Like, a lot of stuff happens sort of off screen and then you learn about it, but it's just sort of very briefly touched upon, and I just thought that those stories could have been built out a little bit more, and I think that it would have been still interesting, and it wouldn't have been boring if they were longer. My other big thing, and also why I think the story should have been longer, is that there was not a lot of politics in this story. And given that you're talking about the Soviet regime in Ukraine, there's a lot of politics that you can bring up. There is sort of mentioned briefly, one of the characters talks about their views on Stalin, but it's really, really briefly mentioned. And I think if there was a reason why Kuznetsova didn't want to include this, there would have been a seamless way to integrate it into the story, i.e. like, oh, there was a lot of censorship, we just didn't talk about those kinds of things, and like, I didn't think about those things when I was younger because it was dangerous to think about politics because you could get in a lot of trouble for voicing your opinions. Like, there were ways of addressing that weren't brought up, and I think the story does suffer from that not being included. Another thing that I thought was cool that Kuznetsova did was bring in Instagram into Natasha's story, and I think she uses this to sort of highlight the sort of social expectations of mothers and of women in general. I think it's just like a cool thing to notice, because it does feel slightly random, but I do think it is a really effective way of reflecting like what gets likes, what are women wanted to do, and it's not pursue their acting careers, if you would guess. It's to post photos of their little snotty babies. I really wanted to include Babi Yar by Anatoly Kuznetsov as an alternative to read if you want to learn more about what Soviet life was like in Ukraine. It's written kind of as though it's like a first person, like almost like a diary, if I remember correctly, and it's, I call it a documentary novel because a lot of what happens, while it is fictionalized in the story, it's based off of first person accounts of what people in Ukraine were experiencing, and there's a lot of like author's notes in a way that are included. My copy is quite old. I got it from a used bookstore. And it begins with like words from Evgeny Yevtushenko, and it has his poem. Let me see if I can find it. His poem is included here. Yevtushenko's poem Babi Yar, because for a long time there wasn't anything that distinguished Babi Yar. It was just like, I don't know exactly what it looks like, but it wasn't distinguished as like a place where there was a mass murder of, I believe, around 30,000 Jewish people were killed there. Last but not least, Do I recommend the story? I do. I think it was well written, very, very, very funny. I mean, I was constantly like reading stuff out to the people I was around because I was just like, wow, this is hilarious. I think it's better than her original book, but also like it was just a story that I was going to enjoy more than her original book as well. A little more like historical based. I prefer that stuff. I also appreciated some of the harshness of the book. I think it was realistic, and I appreciate that realism. If you want to learn about the history of this time, I don't think this book is going to give you the background that you're looking for. So definitely view it more as a like family's story, a story of generational relationships and trauma and like family cycles in that way. Don't necessarily view it as like, oh, I'm going to learn exactly what it was like for every Ukrainian during this period in history. It's not going to be that, but yeah, it's really good. I recommend it. If you've read it, please let me know what you thought below, and hopefully I'll make another book review soon. Thank you.